Somewhere northwest of Ireland, in water nearly 2 miles deep, there are more German U-boats than anywhere else on Earth. Not a museum, not a naval base, the open Atlantic. Over 100 of them, sitting on the seabed in the dark, some cracked open, some still fully intact, hatches sealed the way they were left the day the crews walked off for the last time. Most people have never heard of this place. But if you have ever heard the phrase the Royal Navy scuttled the U-boat fleet, you have only heard half the story. Because the plan was precise. The execution was chaos. And nearly a third of the boats that went down never made it to their intended graveyard at all. They sank on their own, in the middle of a winter storm, dragging Royal Navy sailors down with the tow lines before anyone could pull the plug. This is the story of Operation Deadlight, the strangest funeral the Atlantic Ocean has ever hosted, and the decision that quietly erased one of the most feared weapons of the Second World War. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, there were still more than 150 operational U-boats sitting in Allied hands, and nobody in London, Washington, or Moscow could agree on what to do with them. For 6 years, these submarines had been the single greatest threat to Britain's survival. At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats sank over 3,000 Allied merchant ships and warships, choking off the convoys that carried food, fuel, and troops across the ocean. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the entire war. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had built a force that, boat for boat, outclassed almost anything the Allies could throw at it, and even in the war's final weeks, new Type 21 U-boats were coming off German production lines faster than Allied bombing raids could destroy them. These were the most advanced submarines on the planet, faster underwater than most surface ships of the era, quieter, deadlier. And when the surrender came, dozens of them were sitting intact in Norwegian fjords and northern German ports, fully armed, fully fueled, and completely unsure of what would happen next. The surrender order itself was almost anticlimactic. Dönitz, who briefly became Germany's head of state after Hitler's death, broadcast the command for every U-boat still at sea to surface, raise a black flag, and proceed to designated Allied ports. Crews who had spent years hunting in total silence beneath the waves now sailed openly into daylight, watched by aircraft and destroyers that, weeks earlier, would have tried to kill them on sight. Some U-boat commanders wept. Others scuttled their own boats rather than hand them over, sinking millions of dollars of German engineering in their own harbors out of pure defiance. But most obeyed. Convoys of surrendered submarines limped into Loch Eriboll in Scotland, into Leazahally in Northern Ireland, into a dozen hastily arranged holding ports, where Allied sailors boarded them for the first time and stood in the cramped, oil-stained control rooms that had haunted their nightmares for years. And that was when the real problem began. Because now the Allies had to decide what 150+ of the most advanced submarines in the world were actually worth, who got to keep them, and whether keeping any of them at all was even a good idea. The disagreement went straight to the top. The Soviet Union wanted its share of the fleet outright, and it wanted the newest, most advanced boats available, the Type 21s with their revolutionary underwater speed and streamlined hulls. Stalin's negotiators pushed hard at the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, arguing that since the Soviets had absorbed the brunt of the land war, they deserved equal access to Germany's naval technology. Britain, meanwhile, wanted almost the opposite outcome. The Admiralty had just spent 6 years bleeding merchant sailors into the North Atlantic because of this exact class of weapon, and the last thing anyone in London wanted was for advanced U-boat technology to spread unchecked into other navies, including a Soviet navy that was rapidly becoming less of an ally and more of a rival. The Americans landed somewhere in between, eager to study the technology, but wary of a prolonged argument over ownership. 3 former enemies now had to split the spoils of a war they had barely finished fighting, using a weapon none of them fully trusted the others to control. The compromise that emerged was called the Tripartite Naval Commission, and it produced an agreement that satisfied almost nobody completely, which is usually the sign of a real compromise. The surrendered fleet would be divided 3 ways, between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, with France later folded in as a junior partner. Each power would receive a small allocation of boats for study, evaluation, and limited operation. The Soviets did the same thing, only with far less transparency about it. Moscow received its allotted share of U-boats under the tripartite agreement, but Soviet naval intelligence had already been extracting German submarine engineers, blueprints, and hardware for months, some of it well before the formal division of the fleet was even finalized. Those captured Type 21s and the German engineers who came with them fed directly into early Soviet submarine programs during the opening years of the Cold War, at exactly the moment East and West were transforming from allies into adversaries. The same ocean that had nearly starved Britain into surrender was now quietly seeding the next arms race, using the wreckage of the war that had just ended. France received a small allocation too, and put at least one former U-boat into limited operational service under its own flag, a strange afterlife for a machine built to sink French shipping only a few years earlier. Britain kept a couple of boats for its own testing purposes, including examples that helped inform post-war Royal Navy submarine design, before those too were eventually scrapped or scuttled once their engineering secrets had been fully extracted. So by the time the dust settled in 1946, the once feared U-boat fleet that had terrorized the Atlantic for 6 years had been split into 3 fates. A small number preserved and dissected for their secrets, feeding directly into the submarine designs of the emerging Cold War superpowers. A slightly larger number claimed by the very ocean they were meant to be destroyed in, sinking accidentally before anyone could finish the job on purpose. And the majority, well over 100 boats, deliberately sent to the bottom northwest of Ireland in an operation whose name, Deadlight, sounds less like a naval exercise and more like something out of a horror film. What happened next is where this story gets genuinely eerie. For decades, the Deadlight wrecks sat almost completely forgotten, technically documented on paper but functionally invisible, resting in water too deep for casual diving and too far offshore to draw much attention. Then, starting in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, advances in deep-water sonar mapping and technical diving began to change that. Wreck diving teams and marine surveyors started locating individual U-boats from the Deadlight fleet, some remarkably intact, sitting upright on the seabed as though they had simply parked there rather than been sunk. Divers who reached some of the shallower wrecks described conning towers still bearing faint traces of their original paint, deck guns still mounted, hatches closed exactly as the last German crew had left them before the surrender. One of the strangest details to emerge from these surveys is that because so many boats sank accidentally during towing rather than by deliberate demolition charges, several of them are in far better structural condition than the ones that were intentionally blown apart, meaning the failure of the operation accidentally preserved some of the best surviving examples of Type 7 and Type 21 U-boats anywhere on Earth. Let's talk about a handful of things that almost never make it into the mainstream version of this story. First, some of the U-boats destined for Deadlight were still carrying live torpedoes and ammunition when they were taken in tow, and disposal crews had to work out on the fly how to safely neutralize ordnance on submarines with no functioning crew aboard, in open water, in terrible weather, a detail that turns, "We towed some old submarines out to sea," into a genuinely dangerous demolition operation. Second, the German crews who sailed their boats into surrender were, in some cases, kept aboard briefly to assist with the tow preparations, meaning the very men who had built their lives around evading detection in these machines spent their final days with them helping Allied sailors get them ready for destruction. Third, At least one U-boat that was supposed to be part of Operation Deadlight had already been secretly examined and partially stripped of its most advanced components before it was ever sent out to be sunk, its most valuable engineering effectively harvested before the hull became an anonymous wreck on the ocean floor. Fourth, the accidental sinkings during towing were common enough that Royal Navy officers overseeing the operation began keeping informal betting pools on which boats would make it to the scuttling zone and which would go down early, a grim bit of dark humor from exhausted sailors doing a job nobody particularly wanted. Fifth, and perhaps strangest of all, a small number of Deadlight-era U-boat hulls were never definitively located at all, meaning that even now, decades later, there are almost certainly a handful of German submarines from the largest deliberate submarine disposal operation in history, whose exact resting place has still never been confirmed. The legacy of Operation Deadlight is not really about the U-boats themselves. It is about the moment the Atlantic Ocean stopped being a battlefield and quietly became a filing cabinet, a place to bury not just steel and machinery, but an entire era of naval warfare that the Allies were desperate to control before it could be copied, sold, or turned against them by someone new. The teardrop hull that came out of studying the Type 21 would define submarine design for the rest of the century, showing up in American, Soviet, and eventually every major navy's attack submarines. The engineers who worked on those hulls in 1945 and 1946 were, in a very real sense, designing the opening moves of the Cold War underwater arms race, using the wreckage of the war that had just supposedly ended. A handful of preserved U-boats from this era survive today in museums, most famously the Type 21 U-2540, later recommissioned by the West German Navy and eventually preserved as a museum ship, one of the very few boats from this fleet that escaped both the scrapyard and the Atlantic seabed entirely. Everything else either lives on as a design influence buried in later submarines or as a rusting hull somewhere in the dark, still down there northwest of Ireland, waiting for someone to find it. There is also a quieter human cost to this story that rarely gets mentioned. The German crews who surrendered their boats were, for the most part, simply sent into post-war captivity, their submarines taken apart or towed away without ceremony, without recognition, and without any real say in what happened next. Men who had spent years memorizing every valve and gauge in a control room barely large enough to stand up straight in watched strangers climb aboard, inventory their equipment, and mark their boat for destruction. Some of those same men later gave interviews decades afterward, describing a strange numbness in watching it happen. Not grief exactly, but the particular emptiness of watching your entire war disappear into paperwork. And on the Allied side, the sailors assigned to Operation Deadlight were, for the most part, ordinary crews finishing out their service, men who had survived years of actual combat against these exact submarines, and were now being asked to tow the empty shells of their old enemies through a winter Atlantic for one final thankless job. Nobody involved in Operation Deadlight, on either side, walked away from it feeling like they had witnessed history. They walked away cold, exhausted, and glad it was over, which might be the most honest ending this story could possibly have. It is strange to think that one of the most advanced weapons systems of the Second World War ended its story not in a museum, not in a decisive final battle, but scattered across 100 miles of Atlantic seabed, sunk half on purpose and half by accident, by exhausted sailors just trying to get through one more winter crossing. The U-boats that terrified Britain for 6 straight years did not go out in a blaze of glory. They went out in a storm, dragged behind tugboats, some of them slipping beneath the waves before anyone even finished reading the disposal order. So the next time someone tells you the Allies simply scuttled the U-boat fleet after the war, you can tell them it wasn't that simple. It was messier, stranger, and far more revealing about what the Allies were really afraid of than any tidy version of the story lets on. Somewhere out there, in water most people will never see, Over 100 submarines are still sitting exactly where the ocean put them. Some by design, some by accident, all part of the same forgotten operation. If you want to see what else the war's ending quietly buried, hit subscribe, because the next story is still waiting down there too.